Hello, everyone. Welcome to MisinfoDay. MisinfoDay is hosted by the University of Washington Center for an Informed Public in partnership with the Washington State University Edward R. Murrow College of Communication. I'm Liz Krause, MisinfoDay planner at the Center for the Informed Public. I'm excited to be here with all of you to learn how we can resist misinformation and be better informed. Before we start, I wanted to show you where we're all tuning in from today. We are here with students, teachers, and librarians from across Washington State and the US, and even have some people tuning in internationally. So thank you all so much for joining us. This session is Spotting Misinformation, and we'll be hearing from Dr. Jevin West. Jevin is an associate professor in the Information School at the University of Washington and director of the UW Center for an Informed Public. He is also the co-creator of the course Calling Bull: Data Reasoning in a Digital World. There will be time at the end of the session to answer some questions. So if you have any questions for Jevin at any point during the session, you can use the Q&A form linked in the description box below to submit those. That's all from me. I'll pass it off to Jevin.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Liz, and thanks so much for organizing this amazing event. As Liz mentioned, I'm an associate professor in the Information School. I have my shirt on today at the University of Washington, and I want to call out our partners again, Washington State University, the Murrow School of Communication. They're great partners in all this. And I do know that there's students from all over the country listening, so thank you for tuning in. I think of all the things that we can do around this crisis of misinformation that we are living in today, is talking about ways in which we can all become better information consumers. And actually, one of the things I do every single day is either teaching or doing research in this space of misinformation. So trying to figure out how to compress content, all the things we could talk about in 30 minutes was tricky, just like the tricky art of skepticism. We'll talk about what I mean by tricky art of skepticism, that it's not so straightforward all the time, and it can be a challenge. But one of the most important things that we can do as a society is become better producers and consumers of information. So let's get started. So as we all know, we're inundated with information. All of you are digital natives. You grew up with all this technology. I didn't. There was a time when I didn't even have a computer or the internet, certainly not cell phones. But now we all are swimming in this sea of information. And it's not easy to navigate through that sea of information because so much of it is misinformation, whether it's in the news sometimes, whether it's in social media sometimes or often. It's everywhere. And it doesn't mean there isn't true information out there. There are such things as facts. And our job as information consumers, again, and producers, is to create an information ecosystem so that we can all become smarter and make good decisions and solve big problems. But so much of this being misinformation has big consequences. It's torrential, it's addictive, many times it is unreliable, and it's insincere a lot of times. And we all know that. I don't need to be an adult telling you, all you kids, that there's misinformation out there. You're like, duh, yeah, there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of disinformation, which is intentional misinformation. It's not something that's new. But what is new is, at least for human society, is how to deal with these powerful tools that we have, like social media. And there are consequences. The consequences of misinformation are profound. January 6th was one example of that, but it's not the only thing. There's many things that have been that are major consequences of misinformation. Back in February of last year, before the pandemic had really hit the United States, but was certainly starting to spread around the World Health Organization claimed that we, in addition to being in a pandemic, were in a parallel infodemic. And that term was popularized by the World Health Organization, but many researchers and journalists and librarians and teachers, et cetera, knew that this was a problem well before the pandemic. And the term here just speaks to all the misinformation around the pandemic that was making and is making the pandemic worse. And ultimately, I hate to say it, but really, misinformation in many ways is costing people's lives. It's not the only thing. Of course, the virus itself and the biologic components of this pandemic are certainly a major problem, but so is the misinformation around this. And this is why this is so important, because it literally can save lives if we can clean up the information pollution in our information environments. I think it's one of the most important challenges of our time, and really it's going to come to your generation, hopefully, to clean it up. My generation kind of created the internet and created a lot of these problems. Now it's your job to help clean it up and solve some of those problems. So what can we do about it? And also, who's really at fault? Is it the platforms? Yes, partly. Is it politicians and leaders and maybe laws that are not sufficient at this point? Possibly. Are there nefarious people out there, bad state actors doing things? Yes, there's a lot of people at fault, but you know who's at fault as well? All of us, because we're spreading that misinformation. It's one thing for a bad state actor to create disinformation or misinformation, but if we spread it, then we're at fault too. So we need to get better at identifying when not to spread misinformation. Now, I love this graphic from the WHO, the World Health Organization. It just kind of gives you a sense of how you can stop the spread of misinformation. Here's an example of some people that did spread it and didn't spread it, and those that spread it were the red, and you can see how fast this amplifies. If you were that person that didn't send a rumor because you went into that article and you said, I'm not so sure about this. One thing we say in our center is you got to think more and share less. So if you would have shared just a little bit less, you would have seen from this this graphic that you would have had a big effect on not sharing it with lots of other people. But these individuals that did share it, maybe shared it because they just didn't really want to look into it and dig a little bit further into the source. It started to spread, and the red part is the part that we don't want. So I think this graphic kind of gives you a sense of sort of what we're up against. Now, there's lots and lots of things that we can do so that we're that individual that doesn't spread misinformation. And by the way, it's very difficult. It's tricky, as I started the presentation with, but we can all get better at it, including me, who teaches this and reads about it. I have a book about it, and I do research on it, and it's still hard for me. So don't think that this is just something that is easy and you'll learn it in this 30 minutes here. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lifetime to build habits that make you better critical thinkers, that make you better information consumers. So there's all sorts of things. There's all sorts of tips. And being just staying here with the World Health Organization, these are the kinds of things you're going to see a lot when learning about media literacy and about being a better critical thinker online. Of course, you need to always be assessing the source. If you see a new website or some post on social media takes you to some new website or news site that you haven't seen before, you need to dig in a little bit. You need to see, is this a reliable source? At least, is it mostly reliable? No one gets it right all the time. Not even the best experts get it right all the time, but we do depend on experts still, even if they do get it wrong sometimes. But there are certainly sources that you shouldn't be trusting. If it's a new website that just arose for the first time, if it's a website that does push misinformation often, you might want to question them. You need to go beyond the headlines. I can't tell you, I was going to say how often everyone does, and I have to admit sometimes I do it too, because there's so much information out there. But we need to go beyond just reading headlines. We need to dig in a little bit, read the actual article, and then think about whether we want to spread it. We need to identify who the author is and see if they're a credible source. These are the kinds of things that are basic kinds of tools, and these are things that I want to remind yourself. But I'm going to dig into something a little bit more advanced today. But you also need to check the date, examine supporting evidence, triangulate and corroborate, see who else is maybe saying the same thing or not saying the same thing. You need to check your biases. We all have biases. We tend to go look for information that confirms the stories that we have of the world. Now, this is in the political realm, but it's outside the political realm as well. We don't have time to get into what we call confirmation bias and these biases in general, but just know that we're humans and we have these biases, and we look for things that we agree with and the things that align with our narratives of the world, and that's okay, but just be aware of it. We just want you to be aware, and also use the resources on the web. Fact checkers are a great place, and fact checkers also don't always get it right, but for the most part, the reliable fact checkers out there are a great resource, and I use them often myself. So these are things you want to look out for, and you'll continue to hear these kinds of things when you start learning more about media literacy and being better digital citizens on the web. But what I want to do today is turn to a different kind of misinformation. It's the kind of misinformation I spend a lot of time thinking about and teaching about. And it's a little bit more advanced. So if you don't understand all the examples I give, that's okay. I just want to push you a little bit today. When I was putting together this presentation, I thought, should I go with the basic stuff, which is very important, and we all need to be good at the basic stuff, or should I go a little bit more advanced at some of the misinformation that you might see in high school or middle school, and is the kind of thing that we want you prepared for if you end up going into college or not going to college. We want you to be able to do all these kinds of things. So I decided to choose a couple more advanced material, and it looks more like, well, first of all, I'll throw this out before I show you the more advanced material. There's also, we live in this world now where we have technology that looks so real when it in fact is not. So there's a whole new set of technology called deepfakes. This is new. This is a new ability in the technology world where you can create videos and audio and faces like this that look so human, you would think they're real. So my colleague, Carl Bergstrom, and I created this game called whichfaceisreal.com. You can go there and play this game. The game is very simple. It just says, here's one real image. Here's one image that was created synthetically from a computer. And we say, try to tell us which one's real and which one's false. And you do it and you'll soon find it's really hard. Here's one. Actually, just look at this one. Which one do you think is real? Which one do you think is false? Well, it turns out the one with the blue shirt is the one real. But don't feel bad if you said the red shirt, because I miss these all the time, and I've looked at thousands and thousands of these examples. The main thing is that there's technology now that can create photorealistic faces and videos of people saying things that they never said. Now, does that mean you can't believe anything on the internet? No, it just means be aware of this technology, just like there's technology like Photoshop and other kinds of software that allows you to create synthetic kinds of material and media. The main thing is you just have to be aware. It's harder for your world than when I grew up. We had a lot to deal with rumors and conspiracy theories, but we didn't have this in addition. So watch out for that. So we have a quiz you can take. There's a little around deepfakes more generally, the video portion. So you can go to whichfaceisrealhere.com, or you can go to here the URL is right up here. My screen just moved on me. You can go to this URL at the top, spotting deepfakes, and you can see how well you do at spotting deepfakes. I'll tell you what, it's really hard. So it's not very easy. So don't feel bad if you get it wrong. But the point is, you got to watch out for this. Now, I also have my pet peeves too. So if you're a consumer of information on the web, you see this all the time where headlines just aren't informative anymore. Headlines used to be informative. Now they try not to be. So they don't want to tell you anything except to just hook you into the story. And so my colleague Carl Bergstrom and I, who's a partner in my Calling Bull project, this is one of our newer projects, which is trying to steal the clickbait. So clickbait is this trick that web developers and people that, and the algorithms that create the information environments in which we live today are always, the headlines don't tell you much anymore. They're just there to bring you in. And so you have to watch out for that clickbait. So we started this little project where we see things and put them. I'll give you just a couple quick examples. So here was a story at entrepreneur.com. It says, one simple technique to learn anything. Instead of just telling us what it was in that headline, it wants to suck you in. It wants to hook you and yank you on in. So we try to steal that clickbait and we just give you the answer. So in this case, teach it. That's what the story said, So if you really want to learn something, teach it. So I guess when it comes to misinformation, you should all be trying to teach your parents and your friends and your neighbors about how to become better information consumers, and you will learn according to the story. Here's another one. This one is a little more serious. This one makes you 2 times more likely to die from COVID. This was published in Yahoo.com. Again, this happens on CNN and Fox and MSNBC and Wall Street Journal, you name it. There's all sorts of clickbait nowadays, and you should watch out. Just kind of pay attention a little bit. You'll start seeing these. They're called sort of leading headlines. They don't really tell you what's going to be what the story is about, or just kind of sucks you in. In this case, unfortunately, one of the characteristics of dying, at least in this study, was obesity. But there's another kind of misinformation, and this is the little bit more advanced kind that I wanted to mention. And this kind of misinformation comes in kind of a form that can be intimidating, in data graphics, in numbers, in percentages. These kinds of things can be intimidating, and sometimes we just accept them. We don't question them the same way we would question, one of these headlines that I mentioned, or one of these websites that are a little bit suspicious. But you need to be questioning these things the same way. So here's an image. It's a real graphic from a company that doesn't have any political left or right affiliation. They just sell data, and they had this particular data set where they said carbon dioxide emissions from global fossil fuel emissions have leveled off over, if you look in the blue down here, over the past few years, carbon dioxide emissions worldwide had stabilized. And if you look at this particular graphic, you might think, it's flattened out a little bit. But there's a problem with this graphic. And if I was with you in person, we could look around and you could raise your hand. You can't raise your hand right now because we're doing this virtually today because we are in a pandemic, but I'll assume some of your hands are up, or you might have an answer. And if you're very clever, and when you get good at this, you'll start noticing there is some strange things going on with the x-axis down here. So if you look down here, the data was plotted in 30-year increments, and then all of a sudden at the end, it went in 1-year increments, 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013. And as I tell my students at the university, if you allow me to change the x-axis or the y-axis or bins of a histogram, I can tell any story I want. So if you were to take that exact same data and replot it with even tick marks, so there was 30 years in each tick mark on the x-axis, you'd get a totally different story. So if this was a Twitter post, you could have told a story that said, look, things are flattening when it comes to carbon dioxide emissions. Not really. When you look at the full story, it's not quite that kind of headline. And that's the kind of thing that I want you looking out for as well. And so one of the big things that I do in my class and my efforts at the college level is to teach students to question numbers, because misinformation can come wrapped in numbers as well. And don't just accept numbers. Ask questions of numbers in similar ways. And that's my area of specialty when talking about misinformation. So it's an area we call data reasoning. And it's something that I want everyone to get better at, because if you can, it'll help you deal with all this information that's out there on the web now. It's a kind of information that's growing. You certainly see it with the pandemic, lots of data and charts and tables and graphics and infographics, and we need to be looking out for those. So we have a class, it's got a strong word, you can ignore the word part, it's calling bull at a class. We actually have a non-swear word version too, but we talk about misinformation, data visualization, nature of science, selection bias, which we're going to mention in just a second. We also have a book if you want to go read the book. So I'm going to talk about, there's a whole bunch of things we talk about in the book and in the class, so I don't have time. I only have about 15 minutes or so now to go through the rest of what I want to talk about here. So some of them are harder topics, some of them are a little bit easier, but they're all the kinds of things that we can all get better at, and you'll be able to cut through so much of that BS out there, or misinformation and disinformation, if you identify a couple of these strategies. There's a whole bunch more. This is not a comprehensive list, but here's a few more that you can listen. So first, let's go back to data graphic distortions. So we've made, with the Pacific Science Center, it's a museum here in Seattle, we've created a virtual exhibit. And the virtual exhibit, it's just like an exhibit in the museum, but it's virtual, and we focus on graphics. You're like, how could you do an exhibit on graphics? Well, they're everywhere, and they involve science and non-science topics, and we want you to get better how to do that, because few of us were taught in school how to see through the spin in data visualizations. And so how do we know whether to buy a story a graph is selling or not? So this is really important, and we want to be doing this in middle school and high school, and this is the thing that I'm pushing, and let's do some examples just to see. So here's an example. I'll tell you right away, some graphics have problems and some don't, at least that I can see. Here, I'll start you with one that does have a problem. So what's wrong with this chart? So I live in Seattle, and we do get a lot of rain, especially during the rainy season. And this was saying, Seattle, the next Atlantis, it looks like, the rain is just going up and up and up and up and up and up. There's something wrong with this data graphic. What's wrong with this data graphic? Again, if I was in person, we could let you raise your hand, but if you were listening to the last example, you might be looking at the x-axis and you'd be right, because look at this. Isn't this a strange way of plotting data? It looks a little selective. Okay, you have 1985, and then all of a sudden you jump to 1993, and then you go 2000, 2002, 4, 5, 7, 9, 15, 16, 17. It's not a fair way of really plotting data. So there's all sorts of problems with that one. What about this one? According to one website, this is the only graphic you ever need to see when it comes to global warming. By the way, it's got major problems, so that's not actually true. But what you're looking at is global temperatures, the average annual global temperature in Fahrenheit over the last 100 or so years from NASA. And this is real data. The data has not been manipulated, just the graphic has been manipulated. Well, the problem here is if you zoom far enough out, you can make even a diagonal line look flat. And that's what happened here. I mean, if you zoom in to the time periods that matter, you start to see a 2-degree difference over the last 50 or 60 years. And there we can start to debate about whether there's a problem or not, or how serious that problem is and what's causing it. But certainly, with that last graphic, you wouldn't be able to see that 2-degree increase. Now, we see this in the tech industry all the time, all sorts of graphs showing explosive growth. This was Tim Cook early on when he took over for Apple, and he shows these explosive growth in iPhone sales. There's a problem with this graphic. It's something we call a cumulative graph. That's when you just add on, each year there's more sales, let's say in iPhones, you just add it to the previous sales and it keeps adding up. And here's the kind of secret thing about cumulative graphs, not secret, that they always go up, always. So if you want a graph, make it look like it's going up, use a cumulative graph. Now there are times when you can use a cumulative graph fairly, but here saying there's explosive growth, not so fair, given that quarterly sales here give a much different story. Now there's all sorts of ways to manipulate the x-axis, but also the y-axis. So if you have bar charts, and I see this one all the time, you'll see unfair comparisons between two different groups because people are zooming in further and further, and it makes the differences look bigger and bigger. So here's looking at whether trust in Quebec and the rest of Canada was all that different. Well, it looks big, doesn't it? Look at how big the differences look. Well, also look how far they zoomed in. This is a case where zooming in can be manipulative because you're using area. So it's violating what we call the principle of proportional ink. And if we had more time, we'd dig into some more examples. But all I want you to know is if you replotted these bar charts, this isn't a line chart like we did in the other one where we had to zoom in on the average global temperatures. If you replotted that, you see a much different story. So watch out for those kinds of things. Now, this is a tricky one. This is a little more advanced. This was a graphic that was put out by the Georgia State Department of Health midway through the pandemic last year. And the case here was that it didn't look that much different between July 2nd and July 17th. Looked pretty similar, right? But there was something really wrong with this comparison of this particular graphic. And if you're out there, yell it loud, and maybe I'll hear it over the internet lines. You probably can't yell that loud, but it turns out that the bins used for the colors are different bins. Now, this is an advanced one. If you don't quite understand what's going on here, that's okay. I wanted to throw some more advanced ones out. But this is challenging, or this is not a fair comparison because you have different bins. Now, to defend the Georgia State Department of Health, they say it was just the software that was automatically doing it. And I believe them. I don't think in this case they were necessarily being tricky or nefarious. But this is why we have to watch out when using software to create data graphics. Now, this one was in my news just a month or so ago, looking at how anti-Asian hate crime data in Seattle. Unfortunately, that's unfortunately a story that we're talking about more over the last month. But look, this was on my local news here, and you'll see here that it looks like it's going down. But if you look at the x-axis, what's wrong? It's been reversed. You don't usually see this time going backwards. That's an unusual kind of graph, but you got to watch out for those if you're an information consumer. And here's an example where the y-axis is not looking so right. You have 0 at the top instead of 0 at the bottom. So it looks like after this particular law of Florida enacting a stand your ground law. This was a controversial law around the use of guns in self-defense. It looks like it's going down because of this chart, but because the y-axis was reversed, it's actually going up. Again, these are kind of advanced, and I just wanted to challenge you a little bit today. Now, I'm going to skip through this a little bit and explain that, because there's a lot to explain about this graphic. And by the way, the person that created it was mimicking another graphic that was trying to look like dripping blood. And so again, this is an example where the author wasn't trying to be tricky, he was just trying to do something cute with data graphics. But that's why us as information consumers, we have to be looking out. So, and one thing I should always say, this is one of those sayings you're going to hear more and more as you get older, you get all these quotes, but never ascribe malice what can be adequately explained by incompetence, and never ascribe incompetence what can be understandable mistake. So the point here in this quote is that sometimes there's just honest mistake out there on the web. Sometimes there's purposeful mistake. People are purposely pushing misinformation, but take that into account when you're trying to call it out. All right, so let me just brush through a couple examples from the others. We spent most of our time on the data graphics because I want everyone just to be thinking, I want to get good at reading data graphics, because you're going to see a lot of them in your lifetime. So imagine that I want to run an experiment and I want to see if fresh juice is sweeter than juice from concentrate. So if you go in the grocery store, you can get the concentrate version or you can get the non-concentrate version. I get both, and I could actually run this experiment. So imagine we have fresh juice here and we want to figure out which one's sweeter. We have 21 people that run with this juice on their left and then 4 people on the right. And there's a conclusion that fresh juice is sweeter, and you have all these fancy statistics. You don't need to know any of the statistics. It just looks fancy, right? Doing an exact binomial test. But there's a problem with this comparison. Does anyone know what the problem is? Hopefully you might have seen this. Look carefully at that juice. I'm comparing apples and oranges. You're going to hear this a lot, and you go into as you move forward in your schooling, that you can't compare apples and oranges. It's a saying we use, but it's also a very important saying when comparing different kinds of units, especially when we're talking quantitatively. So let me give you an example, back to examples from the current pandemic, from COVID. There was an infographic that was created early on in the pandemic that said, look at this, what are we worried about? Disease deaths per day worldwide. Look at this, here's orange, here's COVID compared to all these other things. And the main point, this was made by my colleague Carl, who studies this very closely. And the main argument that he was making, among many others that were tracking this, is that's not a fair comparison because that was early on in the pandemic. If you actually then updated that in between these two different time periods and this 1 year time period, you see that it's the comparison is much different now that the pandemic has played out. So the point here is that you have to be careful of these unfair comparisons. Now, one of the more important skills you can learn is noticing when something sounds too good or too bad to be true. This happens all the time. Here's an example that, this was in 2017, shortly after the 2016 election. And there was a lot of talk about international student applications being down. In this tweet, it showed that they were down nearly 40%. But that was right after the election. And they were claiming that it was due to policies of the Trump administration. And the point here is, even if those policies at some point may have hurted admissions, they certainly weren't affecting admissions, several months after the election, because partly college admissions have much longer time cycles anyway. So that just sounded too bad to be true. So if we dig to the source, remember that thing I said at the beginning, dig to the source, don't just look at the tweet, let's go to the article. If you read the article, it wasn't that they were down at 40% of the schools, it wasn't that they were down 40%, it was that they were down at 40% of the schools. So if you had 100 schools, they were down at 40% of them. That's a much different story than saying applications were down at 40%. And if you dig further and you go to the actual article, you find that they were down at 39%, but they were up at 35%. So there's no story there. And it just was too bad to be true. And so looking out for those things is a big thing. I'm going to skip this example. It's a really fun example, by the way, because I'm getting cut a little short for time and I want to finish so we have time for questions. But I'll just quickly say that this was a story essentially saying that being a musician in rap or hard rock or whatever was worse than, it was a worse occupational hazard than being in war. Now that should sound too bad to be true. And in fact, it was. I won't get into how to explain it. We don't have as much time, but essentially, you couldn't compare the people dying in these new genres of music, relatively new, to the older genres of music, because the older genres of music had people that had enough time to live to be 100 years old. And so their average was, of course, going to be higher. So don't need to worry. I had to go through this too fast. Just know that if something sounds too good to be true or too bad to be true, it probably is. Okay, so I'm going to end the last one here with selection bias. If there was anything I can do to give you superpowers of being able to call BS every once in a while, to identify when something is true or not, is to look for this issue of something called selection bias. It's a little bit of an advanced topic, but if you can start learning it now, by the time you graduate high school or middle school, you will be a pro and you'll be able to call your parents out on it sometimes if they make these claims. Now, selection of bias occurs when people you sample differ systematically from the population at large. So it can give you essentially, like if I was trying to measure the average height of America, and then I went to go to an NBA basketball game and I just measured the people on the basketball court, that would give you a biased estimate, right? That's a selection bias because I'm using the NBA players to estimate the average height of America. That's selection bias, and it happens all the time. So let me give you an example from the insurance industry. You guys know, you see this all the time if you're listening on the radio or you're watching sports or movies or if there's commercials, and you see this. Progressive claims that by switching, it saves you $500 on average. But Allstate says the same thing, about the same amount. Actually, you don't save as much there, but it's $2 cheaper. Drivers who switch to Allstate saved $498. New Farmers says you save $502. Geico says you save $500 if you switch, customers. And by the way, we have an email address from our class, and we even got this from Geico. Geico, but still insuring your company on a higher rate, you could save $500. They sent it to us because our name of our email is Bull. Anyway, so how can every insurance company save you $500 on its competitors? First of all, that's assuming that that's actually true, but let's just assume it's true. Well, we have a selection bias problem. If you only look at those who switch, then maybe you would get that high, that kind of savings, partly because you're not going to switch if you're not going to save money, right? You're going to switch because you save money or for other reasons, but certainly for saving money. So that's a selection bias problem. And that's what I want you to look out for. So let's imagine I want to go see birds. I was in Australia right before the pandemic on my sabbatical. And I wanted to go, I heard all these great things about birds in Australia. And I got this map, showed all these places where recent bird sightings were. And I thought, wow, look at the patterns. This is where only the birds go. And I fell for my own problem. Well, does anyone have an idea of why you might see this pattern? If you were showing where birds are found on a map? Well, if you look at the road map, that's where the roads are. So it was a selection bias issue. Certainly there's birds everywhere, but you're seeing those because that's where the roads were. So let me give you an example. I'll skip this one. And this was a story that went viral, and it said that dentists warn of prolonged use of masks due to poor oral hygiene. And they had all sorts of reasons why they were seeing more cases in their office with people with dental caries and major problems in the middle and the beginning of the pandemic. But there's a selection bias here problem. That in the middle of a pandemic, you're not likely to go into the dentist just to do routine as much as, some people do, but most people aren't going to go do routine cleaning. They're only going to come in because their tooth hurts really bad. So of course, these dentists that claim that they were seeing relatively more people with dental cavities and other severe things, because they had to go in, they were hurting so bad. So it wasn't due to masks. It was due to the fact that they had a selection, their conclusion came from a selection bias problem. So how do we refute misinformation? That's a whole nother topic, a whole nother sort of a lecture, but I just want to end with something around digital civics and ethics. You're going to see misinformation out there and you're going to want to call it, and I hope you do much of the time. You don't have to do it all the time. It can get exhausting. I can tell you from my world, it gets exhausting, but we do want you to do it. But here's a couple rules. Make sure that you're correct. Have all the information you need. Don't just quickly, just call something out unless you've done your homework. Run it by a friend, then do it. Be charitable. Don't impute, malice or stupidity or whatever when it could be an honest mistake. Because guess what? We all make mistakes, including myself. So be charitable. Be clear. When you make an argument, be as clear as you can. If you can do this, you'll get more people following your arguments and trusting you. And admit fault. Don't double down. I'll say it again because I'm going to double down on the don't double down. Don't double down. If you make a mistake, admit mistake and move on. And don't be the well actually person, just trying to contradict all the time. Calling misinformation is not about making you smarter always. It's about making us all smarter. And so with that, here's the summary of just a few of the topics we hit. I went through a lot. Some of them were a little more advanced, but I decided I was going to push you a little bit more today than maybe I would in the past. There's all these other really important and also, and I wouldn't say just basic, but a whole bunch of other things we need to be looking out for. And what is the one thing you should get from your educational experience? Going back to the stealing the debate, I love otters. We all love otters. Who doesn't love otters? So I'm kind of having clickbait myself here. But here's the quote that I love from John Alexander Smith back in the 1914. Nothing you will learn in the course of your studies will be the slightest use to you out in the afterlife. Your teachers aren't going to like hearing this. Save only this, that if you work hard and intelligently, you should be able to detect when a person is talking rot. And that, in my view, is the main, if not sole purpose of education. So hopefully you get that out of your education experience. If you want to learn more about all these kinds of resources and things we research and teach, we have a Center for an Informed Public at the University of Washington where we do this full time. So come to us if you're a teacher, librarian, parent, student, please come talk to us. We have all sorts of resources. We add resources all the time. And the last message is, this is all up to you to clean up this information pollution, to address some of these big challenges that we have. We have to get the information right. So it's up to you to help clean it, stop spreading it, but spread good information and, work hard in cleaning that information environment up. So with that, I want to thank you. And I want to turn it over to Liz to take some questions.
Thank you, Jevin, so much for that talk. We have quite a few questions. Unfortunately, not a ton of time, but that's okay. We'll try to get to maybe two. So one person asked, what can you do if a family member gets angry at you or blocks you for fact-checking them on some misinformation they've shared?
That is a great question. And I run into that challenge myself. We all have that. And I think we have to do our best to treat the other person as a human. And that other person probably doesn't like to have you call them out, even though they might probably know you're right. And so I think going offline, maybe going and saying, hey, let's go get lunch or let's go to the park and let's talk about it. I think moving away from the online world and into that physical world again, I think really helps me when I have these conversations. And also, try to find common ground. I think if you can find common ground of things you both believe in, like we both want to have a safe society, or we both want to have good education, or we both want this or that, finding common ground and then trying to find ways to go about it. The other thing is I ask questions. Well, where did you find that? Or how did you come to that conclusion? So ask in an inquisitive way rather than a sort of accusatory way. And so I think those kinds of things help. But it's hard when it deals with our friends and families and neighbors. I think taking a pause and then trying to talk to them one-on-one is sometimes the best thing that you can do.
Great. Next question, does it get easier to spot misinformation the more you practice or encounter misinformation?
Oh, these are great questions. Well, sometimes it gets easier, sometimes it's harder. Like I said, I do this night and day, and I do feel like I get better, but sometimes I run into things that I haven't seen before. So yes, just like anything, you can create habits of mind. You can create these skills and get better at it. But It is hard. And I don't expect, I mean, I certainly don't expect any of us to do it all the time, but just get a little bit better every year or every day or every week. Because I think one of the most powerful things you can do in our information economy now, we live more than half our life probably online, and we're consuming information all the time. The people that will have the most positive influence on this world, hopefully, and those that can help clean up this mess, this information mess, are those with this superpower. And that superpower, like any superhero, will be those that can really discern good information from bad information and can create good information. And it's not easy. It's not easy. But yes, you do get better at it as you do more of it. And hopefully some of you will be then teaching this kind of class and teaching others in the near future. But you got to practice at it to get better.
All right. Thank you so much, Jevin, for speaking to all of us. Thanks to everyone for tuning in. We're so glad you could join us. We hope you can stick around for the next session, which is about fact checking. If you can't, the recordings will be posted after the event, and we'll also be sending out a toolkit with lessons and activities that you can use to continue this learning in your classroom. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.